The letter sat folded in my palm, and my hand had gone strangely cold, colder than the kitchen around me had any right to make it. The stove still held its evening warmth. The clock on the wall kept its steady tick, indifferent to what I now knew. Outside, wind moved through the trees the way it always did, as if nothing in the world had shifted. I read the words again, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into something I could survive. They didn't. My name is Rebecca. I grew up Amish, and this is where I share the parts of that life no one talks about. If you've ever faced a truth your world had no map for, you're not alone here. Subscribe if this finds you, and tell me, has forgiveness ever been asked of you before you were ready to give it? I didn't know grief could feel this quiet. That's what I remember most, standing in my kitchen at 31 years old, the letter still warm from where it had been tucked inside a coat pocket for who knows how long before I found it. No shouting. No breaking dishes. Just a stillness so complete it felt like the whole house had stopped breathing along with me. In the world outside ours, I imagine there are lawyers, papers, someone to call. In my world, there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat and a truth I had no idea what to do with. Our community doesn't have a word for what I was feeling that evening, not one that separates the personal wound from the spiritual one. What my husband had done wasn't only a betrayal of me. It was understood as a break in something larger, a violation of the promises made not just to a wife but to God and to the church that had witnessed our vows. This meant the response to it would never be private, not really, not the way I first hoped it might be. Whatever happened next would move beyond our four walls and into rooms filled with people who had known us both since childhood. There is no courtroom in our world, no judge to weigh what happened and decide what came next. Instead, there is the bishop and the ministers, and a slow, careful process built around confession rather than accusation. I didn't fully understand this yet, standing there with the letter in my hand. I only knew that whatever came next would not look like anything I'd heard about from the English world, the world beyond our fences, where such things ended in courtrooms and headlines. Ours would end somewhere quieter, and I had no way yet of knowing if quiet meant gentler or simply harder to survive. The first thing that had to happen, I would learn, was confession. Not to me alone, not in the privacy of our bedroom where the wound had actually been made, but before the elders first, and eventually before the whole congregation. I remember feeling a strange, twisting shame settle into my chest when I understood this. My private pain, the very worst thing that had ever happened inside my marriage, would soon become something spoken aloud in a room full of people who had sat beside us at every wedding and funeral we'd ever attended. I hadn't yet decided how I felt about that. I only knew it made the wound feel doubled, somehow, carried by more than just myself. That night, I found myself pulling out a small quilt my mother had made me as a girl, one I kept folded at the bottom of a cedar chest for reasons I couldn't always explain. I wrapped it around my shoulders the way I had as a child when the world felt too big to hold. It smelled faintly of cedar and years, and for a few minutes, tracing its uneven stitches with my fingers, I let myself simply exist without deciding anything. I didn't cry, not yet. I think some part of me already understood that whatever tears were coming would need to last longer than one evening could hold. I thought of Miriam then, a woman from a neighboring district who had gone through something similar nearly a decade before mine. I remembered how, at the time, the details had reached me only in whispers, softened and vague, the way such things always traveled through our community. Her husband had confessed, the marriage had continued, and life had gone on the way it always seems to on the surface. But I remembered, too, a certain quietness that had settled over her afterward, a distance in her eyes at singings and quiltings that I hadn't understood then and was only beginning to understand now, sitting alone in my kitchen with my own letter and my own unraveling life. I didn't know yet what would happen after the confession, whether it would close something or simply open a longer, harder chapter neither of us was prepared for. That question sat heavy in me all night, unanswered, the kind of question our world doesn't hand you a clear path through. I only knew that somewhere in another part of our small house, my husband was likely sitting with his own version of that same dread, waiting to learn what price would be asked of him, and whether I would be standing beside him when it was. Because here is a truth I wasn't ready to feel that night, though it arrived anyway. I found myself thinking of him not only as the man who had broken something sacred, but as someone equally lost inside a system that offered him a path to confess but very little guidance on how to actually become a man worth trusting again. I hated him a little that night, and I ached for him a little too, and I didn't yet have the language to hold both those feelings at once without feeling like I was betraying myself for the second one. The morning of his confession, I remember the church house looked exactly as it always did, plain benches arranged in their familiar rows, morning light falling soft through tall windows, nothing about the room announcing what was about to happen inside it. I sat where I always sat, in my usual place among the women, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a moment meant to change everything could unfold in a space so unchanged, so ordinary, so achingly familiar. There was no drama built into the architecture of what came next. Just wood, and light, and silence waiting to be broken. When he stood, his voice was steadier than I expected, though I could see his hands trembling at his sides the way mine had trembled over that letter days before. He spoke the words the process required of him, admitting what he had done, asking forgiveness not only of me but of the church, of God, of the community whose trust he had broken alongside mine. I don't remember every word. I remember the quiet afterward more than anything, a stillness thick enough to feel against my skin, broken only by the soft creak of benches as people shifted, unsure exactly where to look. What I understood only later, turning it over for months afterward, was that the entire process had never truly been built around me. It was designed, carefully and with real intention, around restoration, his restoration to the church, our restoration as a couple, the community's restoration to wholeness after a wound in its fabric. My healing was assumed to follow naturally from his, as though forgiveness offered quickly enough could simply stitch a wound closed without anyone checking whether it had actually healed underneath. No one asked me, in those early weeks, how I was carrying this. They asked, gently but persistently, whether I could forgive. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, the way most true things do, in the space between what people expected of me and what I actually felt capable of giving. I loved my community. I still do. But I began to understand, sitting through the weeks that followed, that forgiveness offered before grief has been allowed to finish its work isn't really forgiveness at all. It's performance, dressed in the right language, worn because it's expected rather than because it's ready. I performed it for longer than I care to admit, smiling through hymns I didn't feel, nodding through conversations that assumed a peace I hadn't yet found. Miriam and I spoke once years after her own experience, in the quiet of her kitchen while our children played somewhere in the yard beyond the window. She told me, finally, what those quiet years after her husband's confession had actually held for her, not peace, not right away, but a long, private grief she'd carried mostly alone, because everyone around her had already decided the matter was settled. Hearing her say it out loud untangled something in me. I wasn't failing at forgiveness. I was simply human, moving through something that needed more time than our process had built room for. Both things are true, I've come to understand, the way both things so often are in the world I grew up in. There is real beauty in a community that chooses reconciliation over abandonment, that refuses to let one broken season end a marriage without at least trying to mend it. I've seen families stay whole because of that belief, children spared the fracture that divorce brings in the world outside ours. And yet there is real harm, too, in a system that measures healing by how quickly forgiveness is spoken rather than how honestly it is felt, that leaves women like me and Miriam quietly carrying wounds no one thought to ask about. My husband and I did stay together, and in time, real healing did come, though it came slower and harder than anyone around us seemed to expect. What helped wasn't the confession itself, but the years of small, private honesty that followed it, conversations late at night where he finally spoke of his own shame, his own loneliness in the months before what happened, and I finally spoke of mine. We built something new out of what broke, not because the process told us how, but because we finally stopped performing the healing everyone assumed we already had and started doing the slower work ourselves. If you have ever been asked to forgive before you were ready, rushed toward peace before your grief had finished speaking. I want you to hear this clearly. Forgiveness that skips the grieving isn't weakness to resist, it's simply incomplete, and it's allowed to take the time it actually needs. You are not required to heal on anyone else's timeline, no matter how gently or how often they ask it of you. Real forgiveness, the kind that lasts, has never once been in a hurry.